Thank you for joining me today for another episode of the Betterment Project, episode 8. I'm Matthew Epperson, and today we are going to be going further into the idea of systems. I talk a lot about systems in my other videos, but I realized I haven't done a dedicated episode really building the idea of systems, and this is my best effort to do that. So this is a further explanation of what is often called emergent properties. I'm simply using the idea of systems as the cause of emergent properties. I'll go ahead and use the language of emergent properties in this video just as an aid to understanding what I mean by systems, but you probably won't hear me say it very often in my other videos. So the idea I'm using of systems is not merely biological or group. It's not simply a thing that emerges out of biological systems and groups. It's anywhere where you have a set of properties that creates a specific outcome. So everything is a system. Everything is, in a sense, an emergent property. And they can be conceptual or physical. Our ideas can be put together in such a way that other ideas emerge from them. You can say that any way you want. You can call that from a subconscious perspective or from an analytic perspective, but our ideas emerge things. So it is the same idea whether it's physical or conceptual. So I tried to find some definitions for systems and for emergent properties. Here's some I found on the web. One from Webster: a regularly interacting or interdependent group of items forming a unified whole. And from a chemistry website, an integrated whole composed of diverse, interacting, specialized structures and subfunctions. So both of those have systems being kind of complicated, unified wholes. I'm not necessarily using systems in that way. I guess I'll talk about that real quick. So there is something to be said for systems being specialized and diverse. I actually really like this chemistry definition. But I believe that when we are talking about systems of the kind I mean in the Betterment Project, well, okay, never mind. The basic principle I'm really aiming at is this idea of, I did not include that in my slides. Okay, I'll talk about it right now. The basic idea of aiming at is that systems are active. There's some kind of, that's why I'm getting confused. Okay, our ideas about all things, when we're thinking about them, are systems. When we are not using our ideas, I would consider that to be simply a network. When the network is engaged, when it's processing, when it's growing and moving and being reshaped, then it's becomes systemic. A book full of ideas, that is a network of ideas that you need the key of language to understand and syntax and such. But when you begin interacting with that book, there's a systemic relationship there. That's pretty good. So set and network, group, these are not necessarily systems. They might be, but I don't mean specifically system when I use terms like that. When I say system, though, I mean something interacting. The Betterment Project was almost called the Betterment System, but I realized that the initials would be BS, and maybe it is BS, but I'd rather think not. So here we are at Betterment Project instead, and we have the category system, which ironically, interestingly perhaps is a better word, if the category system is written down in a book or in notes or on a text file, kind of, that's text file, that's a little more nuanced, but it's a network of ideas. But if you have software running a category system, or if you're using a category system in your head to think through things, then it's a system. Okay, enough on that difference. So another definition I got off of the internet for emergent properties was actually kind of hard finding a good definition for emergent properties. This one was actually off of a forum. Refer to those properties that arise from the collaborative functioning of a system, but do not belong to any one part of that system. In other words, emergent properties are properties of a group that are not possible when any of the individual elements of that group act alone. So, to back up again about the idea of a science definition of emergent properties and systems, and what I'm using here, I'm using a very general version of the term system and emergent properties, something that I can apply to all areas of human thought. That's kind of what the Betterment Project is attempting to do with its property, or with its principles, is to build a system from which we can get any other idea. So, those were the definitions that I was finding on the internet. Here's my way of thinking of these things, and I put them both up, I guess to show that I tried to do some homework and didn't find myself very able to discover whether or not the ideas I have about systems are out there already. I'm a dude that realized that we have problems communicating and started putting my mind to it to try to figure out how to solve that problem. And I'll tell you real quick, actually, how I came up with the idea of systems, even though I wasn't planning to. I was trying to understand what is the central, primary principle of the Betterment Project. How do I get to that one point? Because that's how we've kind of been taught to think. We're looking for the one cause, right? We're looking for the singular linear answer to any situation. What is that cause? The cause. And I racked my brain for I remember several hours at least, but it was more like a week of processing. And then I'd gone so many different directions, I couldn't find a new direction. I was like, it's almost as if all these principles are core. And then I kind of got a point of epiphany where I'm like, oh, it can't be a singular point. It cannot be. They're all interrelated. They're systemically related. Oh, okay. And I created this thought experiment of a universe comprised of one molecule or one something that is composed of nothing but itself. That would be a truly singular universe, a truly singular cause-effect relationship. Well, there's no cause-and-effect relationship. I suppose you could add some kind of bouncing back and forth with another object, and it's a singular cause-effect relationship. I see us, however, existing in a far, far more complicated universe, and I think we can't use the ideas of linear singular to truly process everything that we experience, and especially not to process how we're going to get along as a society. So, getting to the definition finally, a set of categories or parts. So, parts is another way of saying the things that are in a system, bound together by the production of a unique emergent property. So in other words, I'm defining the system in terms of what emerges from it. But remember that I'm not using quite as tight a term on emergent properties as science is, which is probably why I don't like using it. That's kind of their term that they use for really complicated things that we really have no idea of understanding. I'm using systems to describe almost everything. A car is a system, especially if it has a driver. It doesn't have a driver. It's just a network of parts that aren't doing anything. If it has somebody that can turn the key and turn it on and start driving it, suddenly you have a systemic relationship between the car and the person that allows this bizarre emergent property of driving 88 miles per hour in metal and gas. It's like, okay, I have a pile of metal, I have a pile of rubber and petrol and such, and then I have a person. How are these going to go 88 miles per hour? Well, you build a time machine. A car. Sorry, 88 miles per hour. Okay, so emergent properties. Categories which emerge only as a result of specifically ordered and active systems. This will probably look a little circular because I'm defining categories or systems in terms of their emergent properties and emergent properties in terms of their systems. And you could call that circular if it were not for the way the category system orders data, because it's saying this set produces this one point. This one point is a product only of this system, of this set. So I just thought of this. Another way of thinking of all this is that systems are the general form, systems and what they produce are the general form of systems that produce emergent properties, in the biological sense, in the more complicated scientific sense, in the rigorous sense in which I am not an expert of. All right, so a few more definitions. How well the emergence is produced indicates optimization. The simplest version of a system that still produces emergence is minimal. Beyond that, the system stops producing its minimal emergent property. So I'm saying that this actually came about as I was investigating the ideas of sufficient and necessary, kind of classical philosophical ideas. I realized that, well, others have realized that there are problems with them. And as I was investigating the ideas of systems, I realized, systems are a good solution to this necessary and sufficient problem, but we need something more like an optimized system and a minimalized system. Those are kind of the 2.0 version of necessary and sufficient, if you will. So to give an example, an optimized car is one that is getting great gas mileage, is no parts, or everything's running smooth as silk. It's quiet in the cab. You can get to where you're going as efficiently as possible. That's an optimized car. A minimal operating car would be one that is just barely functioning, but it still functions, right? Maybe you loosen one bolt, or one piston ring cracks a little bit more, or something else happens, and boom, it's not operating anymore. That's what I mean by the idea of beyond the minimal point that the system is operating, you no longer have a system. You merely have a network of parts. So, I think this is the last definition we work with. Nodes are those points at which a system can interact with other objects or systems. This is a conceptual idea. This is not like I'm not necessarily pointing at nodes. Nodes can be more conceptual than simply something you can gesture at. But this can be a steering wheel, a mouth, a skin, or it can indicate any interaction that damages a system. So, for instance, if you throw a paper plane at my body, there's not going to be much systemic interaction. Maybe on some strange microscopic scale there is, but it's basically not any kind of effect on the system. So there's no node interaction there. However, there is a node interaction if you throw a rock at my head, right? Busted skull or skin or bleeding and all that kind of thing, the system might even break down completely. That is considered a node, even though it is not what we think of as a design element, right? The body wasn't designed to die from a rock, but it does, right? It does. Effectively, that's a part of the system. So any interaction with the system that changes the way the system operates or produces some effect is a node. So to illustrate systems a little bit, from this illustration, the bigger circle is the bounded set of everything that is a part of that system. The parts, or whatever it is that makes up the parts of the system, that are necessary or, not necessary or sufficient, that are at least minimal or are optimally organized. And we can talk about complete and accuracy in the way they're organized, right? And then the nodes, which I've designed here as little squares. I intentionally put some of the circles overlapping, some of them just barely touching. The same with the squares, in order to try to illustrate the idea that the things that interact within a system often do overlap, right? Sometimes they're inside of each other. Sometimes they don't interact at all. Okay. Thinking back to, hopefully you've seen episode 2 or rather 3 and 4, the graph at the bottom, the ovals, is a visual representation, a map, if you will, of a category system. I don't have the labels on this, but from the now to story is the personal area. Then you have the story, of course, and then from story to logic, you have the conceptual area. Now, what I'm trying to illustrate here is that you have graded levels of systems, and they are graded by how certain we can be of their existence, how provable they are, how confirmable they are. For a level 1 or a first order, however you want to describe it, specific system, these are our daily practical immediate interactions we have. I am interacting with a person right now. That's pretty confirmable. That's about as confirmable as we know how to get, right? I mean, even somebody can even be telling us that they know all about science and this is scientifically accurate. If we do not have some way of confirming what they're saying, though, ourselves, I mean, it is more likely that they are a person talking to us than their scientific claims are true. However, I am claiming that there is a degree of scientific factuality and especially logic that can be considered a first-order confirmed system. That's what I probably should have named this. First-order confirmed systems. Okay. Note that. That's what I should have put on the file. Okay. I don't know how much I talked about this in video 3 and 4, but logic, by logic, I don't simply mean syntax and the way ideas and words and language work together, but also how numbers work together. So this is both syntax and math. This is that's all those ideas. I'm just, again, the models are meant to be general in such a way that they apply to everything. So the words I'm using here do not necessarily have the specific uses where we may be used to. This is a general model that is supposedly able to integrate with any specific issue we are dealing with. So certain minimal, well, I'm not going to get into epistemology here. Certain minimal ideas of science and logic are first-order confirmed systems. The optimal and the ideal and the practical and the technical, those are areas of more complicated issues. You notice that there's an arch, there's a thickening at the area of story on this graph of a category systems. That is because we have more data to work with. In fact, we have so much data that we're not very good at processing it at that point, right? It's really, it's like we have so much in the area of story. Everything is represented in the area of story, or at least as much as we know, as much as we're aware about. That's where we kind of come together and put everything together and build our ideas and find out what we want to do with our lives, what we want to not do with our lives as well. And but it's real easy to get confused about what is true in that area, right? So that is why it is a third level system. It's obvious something is happening. We are aware, it appears to be the case that there is some kind of story happening. We're just not sure what kind it is, right? But there's a funny little irony there, which is that the area of story is actually one of the most important things in our lives. It is the least confirmable, but the most important, right? Because you can have a fact about what is in the immediate. You can have a fact about the person in front of you, or you can have a fact about some logical mathematical equation. But what does that matter? I mean, if you're living for an equation, where does that get you? There's not enough information there. If you've got a person in front of you, well, what? There's a person. A child sees a person, doesn't know what to do with them, right? So we have to have a story. It's the most important part of our lives, right? Okay, is there anything else I need to say about that? Oh, so there's a duality that happens between these ideas of immediate, practical, and technical, and the ideal, the optimal, and minimal. In that if I have a skill, let's say, a practical, immediate skill I'm using, I may not even know how that skill works from a theoretical viewpoint, a conceptual viewpoint, right? However, someone could have a concept of how that that skill works. If I'm a woodcutter that has no idea how theoretically wood grain works and is grown and the way the physics of the knife work in the wood, then so what? I'm still doing it, right? It's personal, it's specific, it's practical. But that all of that is mirrored in some minimal or optimal theory, maybe even an ideal theory. I guess I'll say real quick that the technical and the ideal are areas that I have not fully fleshed out. They intuitively feel like they need to be there more than I have very, very, very good reasons putting them there, because they're kind of an intermediate. They are an area where our stories are blending with either our immediate experiences and the ways we skillfully or habitually work with the world, or it is where our minimal and optimal conceptual systems, our ideas about the world, interact with our story. So ideal is meant to sound something like idealism or idealistic or an ideology, because it is a place where our ideas have not been refined, or perhaps if they haven't been refined, that's where they are. We think they're fact, right? We're not humbly saying this is just a story that I'm trying to live by, which is kind of the model the Betterment Project is suggesting that we do. We have a story that we've committed to. That's third area is also the most important to us because that's where we live our lives from. We're committed from there. But you might be like, no, it's absolutely certain. And then you're like an ideologue. But you haven't actually refined your ideas to the point of logical and minimal, if you haven't, in fact. Hopefully you make an ideal and then you start refining it. That's the model that I'm suggesting here. Technical is a little stranger. I had in mind the idea of the way your skills become more complicated with the more knowledge you have of our universe, and how our skills become, practical and skills being kind of synonymous here. It becomes more interconnected with our worldview at the point of the technical. So maybe technical is not the best term to use. I was thinking in terms of engineers, actually, when I chose that term. And I had many models before this model. Many of them used the idea of engineering there. And I came up with this word technical, but the more I've refined it, I'm not sure it's the best term. But that's enough talking about the weaknesses of my system, right? Okay, so first level systems are more confirmable, like we said, but third level system builds toward a more complete and accurate model, right? Because we're trying to create an overall worldview of everything. Okay, so just to elucidate a little bit more on the category system while I'm here, from the now to the story, we are building up, right? We are making observations. We're seeing the way the world works from a practical viewpoint, and we're building a story out of that. Eventually, humanity got to the point of building a story called Science and Reason, and we began to be able to test those things. And before we were able to do that, this structure did not quite look like this. You might imagine a structure that did not have the optimal and the minimal. It had some minimal idea of logic, but it did not have these testing areas, the systemic testing areas. Science is kind of like a system, right? Every experiment is like you've set up a scenario in which you've removed every system that could mess up the system that you're trying to get to work, right? You're trying to make sure the nodes are minimal. You're trying to make sure that only those parts that you want to test are present in the system. Then we get to see if the system works, right? If it has an emergent property, not in the complicated biological technical sense, but just in general, does the system work? Does it fulfill its function? So when we have our stories, then we begin breaking down our ideas. We begin abstracting them. We begin testing them. And we start finding the core facts of our story. Doesn't mean we can test everything, and doesn't mean we know how to put the facts together. That's a huge issue. I really think we haven't truly considered the idea that everything we currently know about science doesn't necessitate naturalism at all. They're just facts. How you put those facts together shows the story you've committed to. All right. And to speculate real quick, archetypes are something I've always been a little interested in, and then since Jordan Peterson emerged, I'm a lot more interested in it. I don't know how to fit archetypes strictly into this project yet. I'm hoping to learn more. I'm reading JBP's books. But what seems clear to me, although you could talk about archetypes in an idealistic, maybe even an optimal context, those are areas of abstraction, right? You're paring down the amount of parts you have in a system. Whereas an archetype, it's only about paring down to the most general story you can possibly make about some aspect of the overarching story, right? We're all experiencing, every human that has ever lived, is experience this giant global narrative called life. And what appears to be the case, at least something that we can do, in which our unconscious appears to do to some degree, although I'm not saying it's certain that this happens, is distill those ideas down into a story, a shape, a general shape, an archetype. Whether it's a hero myth is the person who is motivated plus a goal that must be done in order to save somebody, something like that. Whereas, the mother is a birther of something which wishes to make it survive, help us survive, something like that. These are huge ideas, huge to our lives, huge to every part of us. I think it's becoming clear that we're going to have more complicated archetypes. I mean, it's already emerging. Jordan Peterson I didn't mean to make this into a Jordan Peterson episode, but I'll say this. Jordan Peterson came out very critical of the movie Frozen. I think Frozen was a great film, but it is certainly not a typical classic archetype. It is an emergent archetype of our society, right? Because we have gone to the point where we don't have to specialize our skills as male and female anymore. The female can do just about anything the male can, in general, right? I'm not talking about the possibility of sexism in the workforce and stuff like that. I'm just saying in general, we're not starving. So, like, the male-female dichotomy is great in a sense. If you're starving, nothing's great when you're starving. But it works when you're starving because it's like, okay, you take care of the kids, I got to get some food. You're more equipped for that. You're socially equipped for that. You're also more physically equipped for that, arguably, right? I'm equipped with the big body and the desire to go kill things, so I'm going to go do that, right? So those are the classic archetypes. The current archetypes are much more complicated, and we haven't quite figured out how to balance all those things. Didn't mean to go into all that, but it's interesting, right? And that's all I really have. I'm still working on this notion of systems. This is my best current theory of systems, if you will. Doesn't probably look much like a theory. It probably reflects the way I think about it. Systems are kind of a grab-all I'm using in opposition to this idea of singular linear, which I think doesn't function as well. It gets us too focused on trying to find the one answer, right? And if you're trying to negotiate, if you're trying to survive, if you're trying to live in harmony with others, then having a single answer, having a single social answer is helpful, or a single methodological answer might be helpful. But it has to be able to allow many solutions that individuals can use, even if the society has a different kind of solution, something like that. Thank you for joining me for this episode. Hope you will join me next time. Hope you will like this video and follow my channel. That'll help YouTube say, hey, that guy seems interesting. Let's show him to more people. And leave lots of comments. I want comments. I want to know what you think. Please. I have no comments. I have none. All right. Thanks a lot. Bye.